day of the month. Okay, now let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5, and we'll look at Saul's 2-day feast. It says, "And David said unto Jonathan, Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king at meat." So notice the day. Tomorrow is the new moon, so this day had to be either the 29th or the 30th of the previous month. He says, "But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field unto the 3rd day at even." Now this 3rd day is the 3rd day of the month, as we'll see, because it's said to be the day after the 2nd day of the month in verse 27. So the 3rd day at even. Now let's look at the next verse, or verses 18 and 19 of this chapter. It says, "Then Jonathan said to David, Tomorrow is the new moon, and thou shalt be missed, because thy seat will be empty. And when thou hast stayed 3 days, then thou shalt go down quickly and come to the place where thou didst hide thyself when the business was in hand, and shalt remain by the stone Ezel." So here it says, when thou hast stayed 3 days, tomorrow's the new moon, you're supposed to go and wait and stay there for 3 days. And then notice what it says in verses 24 and 27. It says, "So David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon was come, the king sat him down to eat meat. And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the 2nd day of the month, that David's place was empty." Notice that the new moon happened. The 2nd day of the feast was on the 2nd day of the month. That David's place was empty. And Saul said unto Jonathan his son, Wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to meat, neither yesterday nor today? So the 2nd day of this feast was the 2nd day of the month. Now let's notice what it says in verses 34 and 35. It says, "So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and did eat no meat the 2nd day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had done him shame. And it came to pass in the morning." Now what day is this? It's the following day after the 2nd day of the month. So now it's the 3rd day of the month, which was the day that they agreed to meet. The 3rd day of the month. This is not the 3rd day of the new moon. This is the 3rd day of the month, the day which they agreed to meet. And it says that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David. This is the 3rd day of the month, a little lad with him. Now the word appointed, the time appointed, you might notice what that word is. It's moed. For those of you who have studied this, moed is a time appointed. It can be a time or a place appointed, and this particular place was on the 3rd day of the month. The particular time was on the 3rd day of the month, and it was appointed by Jonathan and David. They appointed it together. So now let's go on to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 4 through 6. It says, well, actually right before I read that, I would like to comment just a little bit more. Now a lot of times people who claim that the lunar Sabbath, that we should keep lunar Sabbaths, they say that there are 2 days at the end of each month, 2 or 3 days that are not 2 or 3 day Sabbath feast that is to go on. And here they use this proof here that Saul had a 2-day feast to prove that we should keep the new moon days would be the 30th day of the month and the 1st day of the month. That's the 2-day new moon feast. However, if you notice, this does not fit that. The timing of this feast was on the 1st day of the month and the 2nd day of the month. It was not the 30th and the 1st. It was the 1st and the 2nd. And the 3rd day of the month was the day that David and Jonathan met together. So this does not prove at all that the new moon days should not be counted, which has been used to argue that we should not count the new moon days, the 30th and the 1st, toward the counting to Pentecost. But here you notice this 2-day feast was the 1st and the 2nd days of the month. They were counted toward the month. They were counted toward the week. Now, let's notice what it says in 1 Samuel 21. And the reason we're going right here to 1 Samuel 21, this is right after what we just read. Right after he had this encounter with Jonathan, 1 Samuel 21 starts, and it says, he went to the priest, and it says, "And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now, notice what it says here, that David had gone 3 days. It says it's been 3 days since we came out. So he was on a journey for 3 days. When did he leave? He left on the 3rd day of the month. You go back to chapter 20. That's when he left. He traveled for 3 days, and he came to this priest, and notice what happens. He asked the priest for bread. And what does the priest say? The only bread we have is this showbread. The showbread is all we have, and it says that it was sanctified this day when it was in the vessel. But now it's common bread. What does that mean? That day it was sanctified, but on the same day it became common bread. Why? What happened? When did the showbread get taken away from the tabernacle? It always happened on the Sabbath. This was the Sabbath that David met with this priest. And it was 3 days after he left Jonathan, and he left Jonathan on the 3rd day of the month. 3 days from that is the 6th day. The 6th day of this month is a Sabbath, because this is the day that the showbread was taken out. And we know that it had to be a Sabbath because it says it was sanctified on that day, but now it was common. It had just been taken off from the temple, so it had to have happened on the Sabbath. And that showbread did not last very long. What happened? They took the showbread off, and then they went immediately, divided it among the priests, and they ate it that day, or the next day, depending on the circumstances, whether the atonement was on what day the atonement fell. But I'd like to read a couple commentaries on this. And first we'll read verses 8 and 9. Oh, I'm sorry, we already read 8 and 9. Oh, it's Leviticus 24, 8 and 9. Forgive me. It says, Every Sabbath he shall set in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant, and it shall be Aaron's and his sons, and they shall eat it in the holy place, for it is most holy unto him of the offerings of the Lord made by fire by a perpetual statute. So notice the priests were to eat the showbread in the holy place. They weren't even allowed to take it home. They had to eat it right there. And we can see what happened. The priest had just taken the bread out of the tabernacle, just exchanged it with the new bread, and now he's bringing the bread over to the holy place to allow it to split it among the priests, and David met him right there when they were coming. So David met the priest on the Sabbath day. Now, look what John Gill has to say on this. This is a commentary on it. It says, But the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, from off the showbread table, and it seems to have been just taken off, it being Sabbath day, and not as yet carried to the house of the priest, and divided among the other priests as usual, and which was then removed to put hot bread in the day that it was taken away. So we see that the showbread had to be taken away on the Sabbath, and this is what was happening on the 6th day of the month. Now also notice, John Gill continues, it says, And they shall eat in the holy place, in the tabernacle, or some court of it, and not in their own houses. It is said the showbread was not eaten